Welcome. This is the first of a few additional videos that I'm going to do during our study of the book of Revelation. Our next quarter, we will be looking at this wonderful, exciting book on Sundays. We have 13 weeks to cover 22 chapters. That means that we're going to be moving at a very quick pace. Our theme for the year is Magnify Our God. And with that theme in mind, we are going to be looking at the various pictures of worship in the book of Revelation. So that's going to be our focus every week. And so we don't miss some of the big things going on in Revelation. I want to do a few videos interspersed throughout the quarter, very short things, and this is going to be the first, and we want to introduce the subject of apocalyptic literature. As I was preparing for Bible class for this coming Sunday, I knew I just had too much material on the introduction of Revelation and chapter 1. And I don't want to have to fight the clock. So I thought I'll just take out this information on apocalyptic literature and put it into a short video. We'll just run through some things because understanding the genre of Revelation is a big key to understanding Revelation itself and to not making a lot of the mistakes and assumptions that people make in the world about the book of Revelation. And so a lot of this is going to be parallel to the book that I'm passing around. I had a few copies. Some of you have borrowed some. It is Mark Roberts' book on understanding apocalyptic literature. I have one more copy that's not being borrowed and read right now. If anyone wants this other copy, please let me know. And when y'all get done reading that, we can pass them along to someone else. It should be absolutely required reading for anyone who wants to study Revelation. It just helps you get in the right mindset. And hopefully this video will help with that as well, kind of remind us of some important things to think about as we study the book of Revelation. When we think about different types of literature, we understand what genre is, and for the most part, we understand how to read various types of genre. And so if we open a letter and read, "Dear Michael, I hope this letter finds you well," we know what we're reading. We know how to read this. We know that it probably came in the mail, that it was sent from someone who knows us. We know what to do with a letter. We know how to read a letter. And the same thing is true if we're going to read a bedtime story to our children, once upon a time in a land far, far away. We understand what's going on with that type of literature. Maybe we've opened up something from IKEA and we see step 1, attach piece A to piece B using the fastener provided. Actually, I'm not sure that many projects come with that detailed description anymore, but we know what to do with plans when we see them. I just got a text from my brother just a moment ago that some police officers had been shot in Muscle Shoals, back where I'm from. And it's horrible news, but we know what the newspaper is going to read. I already had this in the slide. At approximately 9:15 this morning, a masked gunman opened fire. We know that we're reading a news piece, and we know how to take that information in. We even, though we may not like it, we even know how to read sections that start like this. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. We might not like those sections, but we know how to read the genealogies. We know what's going on there. We know what genre we're dealing with. Even when we open to the Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," we know we're dealing with Hebrew poetry. And we may be a little less familiar with some of the aspects of Hebrew poetry, but we know how to read the Psalms for the most part. But then we get to Revelation. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its head. And we get to this kind of literature, and this is apocalyptic literature, and we start doing strange things with it. Strange things happen in our mind, and this isn't really unexpected. It's because we don't have a lot of literature like this. It's not common for us as some of these other types of genre are. We know what to do with most types of genre, but when it comes to apocalyptic, we don't always know how to proceed. So let me give you the stuffy definition, the technical definition of apocalyptic literature from the Society of Biblical Literature. Apocalypse is a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial insofar as it involves another supernatural world. It is intended to interpret present earthly circumstances in light of the supernatural world of the future, and to influence both the understanding and the behavior of the audience by means of divine authority. Now, there's a lot in there, and that's about as wordy as the Apostle Paul is sometimes. And fortunately, our friend Mark Roberts has broken it down for you a little bit better. One of the benefits to his book here, Understanding Apocalyptic Literature, he says it's a story written in a time of distress and crisis that is given by otherworldly beings, explaining how God will reverse everything so the righteous will triumph. That's a lot easier to understand. We'll kind of stick with that as our definition of apocalyptic. And so you kind of see the background for apocalyptic and when you might find apocalyptic literature. And that will hopefully help us as we think about the book of Revelation. The genre of apocalyptic literature was very common for the 300 years surrounding the time of Christ. That's where a lot of the Jewish apocalyptic literature comes from. It is produced in a time of crisis and conflict. We saw that in the definitions we were looking at. We see that with Ezekiel and Daniel as the people of God, as the Israelites are in Babylonian captivity, a great time of crisis for them. And both Ezekiel and Daniel have a lot of apocalyptic influence. They have a lot of apocalyptic sections in them. Zechariah is very apocalyptic. He just gets downright weird, but we got to be able to handle some Zechariah if we're going to be looking at the book of Revelation. Then there are others. There is 1st Enoch, there's Apocalypse of Baruch, there is 2nd Esdras, and 4th Ezra. And then we have the book of Revelation, and that is a book that was written in a time of crisis and conflict, and we will talk about that on Sunday. And what it does is it presents the information that God wants us to have, the outcome that God is going to bring about in the form of a story. It's not necessarily literal events in the past or future. Sometimes they're just kind of connected. There's links to those kinds of things. And we see that it is dramatic and drastic. Let's do some comparison. Let's think about some facts that are presented in the book of Revelation, and let's then think about how Revelation presents this information. So a statement of fact may be that society often pressures Christians to stand down or to assimilate to the surrounding culture. Now we read that, and that makes sense to us, and we can understand that. And while that makes sense, though, that might not make an impact on us. However, that we are engaged in a war with a dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns who desires nothing more than to devour us and our children, that may make a little bit more impact. That hits a little bit harder and causes us to wake up and think about what's being said, to think about the symbols that are being used. We can do this again. We have pagan Rome has overstepped its bounds. I am convinced that the book of Revelation is about the empire of Rome, and specifically lots of the emperor worship that's going on. Well, that is a matter of fact there, that they've overstepped their bounds. We understand what that means. But again, this hits a little bit differently. I saw a prostitute clothed in purple and scarlet, seated on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and I saw a woman drunk with the blood of the saints. Whoa, that reads a lot differently, and yet John is making the point that pagan Rome has overstepped its bounds, but this just causes us to respond differently. It wakes us up and causes us to begin thinking about some of these things. Well, apocalyptic literature has a number of different themes in it. We're not going to belabor the points here. The horror of human evil, the announcement of a specific time of deliverance. You'll get sometimes more generic statements as time is concerned, something like time, times, and half a time. Things like that are often used. Phrases like that are often used. We often think about repentance that leads to deliverance. And I especially like this concept. Excuse me. It is cosmic war that stands behind human conflict. The last time we went through Revelation, the background I used was someone pulling a curtain back. And that's what we really see in a lot of apocalyptic literature, especially the book of Revelation. We are used to our world. We are used to our cosmos, our lives. And John has the curtain pulled back from him so he can see into this spiritual realm in which there are angels and dragons fighting and just almost chaos. And this is one of the themes of apocalyptic literature. There is judgment for those who resist God and oppress his people. And then maybe a final theme here is, though downtrodden, God's people will experience new life in the fullest. It may not always be here. That may be in the end. But that is a theme. It is a hope. It is something to look forward to. And so as we think about the book of Revelation, we can kind of put some of this conflict that gives rise to this apocalyptic literature. With each successive emperor, praise and devotion of Caesar grew. They used to kind of save the deification for an emperor who had died, and the Senate might deify them. But by later in the first century, these emperors are claiming deity for themselves. In response to benevolence from the emperor, maybe the emperor donated something to a city would build and dedicate a temple to the emperor. And when you combine this with the traditional pagan worship of the various gods, often related to the guilds, the labor guilds and that kind of a thing, you see kind of a setup for a situation that's not going to be good for Christians. And to not participate in this kind of religion, we can probably use quotation marks there, it marked one as unpatriotic or even atheistic. You don't believe in the gods? You only serve one God. That doesn't make sense. And as this practice of emperor worship, as it grew, so did the distrust and the hatred of Christians and Jews and those who would not participate in these things. And we do want to make the point that this was less of a government-sponsored persecution and more of a societal issue, that the people around you would ostracize you. The people around you might turn you in, might turn their backs on you. And so that's something important to keep in mind as well. As we go through this quarter studying the book of Revelation, there are some things that we really want to keep in mind. The book is highly poetic. We're going to use images. We're going to use pictures. We're going to have some poetry. And when we think about that, poetry allows the writer to enhance everything. It's not just this statement of fact. Go back to those comparisons we looked at earlier. It's highly stylized. John is seeing a picture and he's trying to describe it in a way for you to see it as well. It's highly emotive. As we read these things, it does hit us differently and it causes us to think and to have a reaction to these pictures that we are reading about. And because of that, we need to use our imagination. I don't often like to use the pictures that you can find. If you want to look at them, that's fine. I don't have a problem with it. But I don't want to box people into a corner when it comes to picturing what John is seeing and describing here, because he wants us to use our imagination. He wants us to build this picture. There's plenty of stuff out there on Google if you'd like to see it. Craig Kester says, instead of defining evil abstractly, John pictures a dragon threatening a pregnant woman. When critiquing imperial rule, he describes a seven-headed beast dominating the nations and slaughtering the saints. When offering hope for an unseen future, he provides a visual tour of Jerusalem with its gem-like splendor. And I like that phrase for right here in our list of things to remember. Craig Kester does a really good job of keeping that idea in this emotive, stylized, imaginative language here. We're supposed to be using our minds. We need to really remember that one detail over here does not always equal another detail over here. That we don't always have a one-to-one correspondence with that. And especially important is the fact that not every detail has some grand meaning. The scales on the dragon or something along those lines. Not every detail has a grand meaning. Sometimes the story just needs to be filled out. The author did not count the Roman rulers from the beginning of the empire until his own time and then create a beast with a suitable number of heads. If you've read Revelation, you know where I'm talking about here. For him, the 7 heads of the beast, like those of the dragon, were a given. They signify the totality of the beast's dominion. And so the warning here is not necessarily to count and try and set up a timeline with these heads, but to get a picture and sense of the symbology that's going on here. We need to remember that not every detail has a meaning. Pictures must be filled out. Stories must be filled out. And in the parable of the sower in Matthew 13, I don't think any of us would want to discuss or debate what the bag that the seed is in symbolizes. Now, we get what's going on. We get the picture. We have enough information to make sense of the parable. It helps that Jesus explains it as well. We don't go into like looking for meaning in every little detail. The parable of the 10 coins, well, what does the broom symbolize? In 1 Corinthians 5, the man who has his father's wife, there are certain questions we don't ask because they don't do anything. They don't help us to better understand what's going on. We don't care about his name, where he lived, how old he was, what color his hair was. We don't, those kinds of things don't matter. We know the point that Paul was trying to make. And that's what we want to do with John. And so it really is very important to get a view of the forest and not so much scraping the bark off of each and every tree, trying to get a detailed microscopic inspection of the tree. Let me explain what I think is kind of going on here. And I wanted to work through this for myself. If it helps you, great. If not, then just toss it. But this seems to kind of be what's going on. John is seeing these things. And so in Revelation 13, John sees this beast from the sea. And then John has to write it down. And that's what we read. This is obviously inspired. What John saw, it was from God. What John wrote was from the Spirit. And this, however, leads to our minds, the imagination of the readers as they think about this beast from the sea. And so I don't think it's essential that we all have the same picture of a beast. These are just 2 that I happened to find online that weren't terribly corny. And so you have these pictures of the beast. Well, what do these pictures do? What's going on with these pictures? Why does John choose these details? Well, in this case, in Revelation 13, 1 through 8, he picks these details because this beast is like a mutation of all the beasts in Daniel 7. Remember, Daniel has apocalyptic literature in it. And when you look at the beast of Daniel 7, you combine them all together and you get what looks to be like this beast from the sea. And so we can kind of look backwards and pull out some information from Old Testament literature that tells us that in Daniel 7, we're looking at these beasts that represent different empires. And maybe we're to the fulfillment of that language there. And then also we can look forward and see that this beast imitates the lamb. And so we have this beast, and it's an amalgamation of all these other beasts from Daniel 7. It's trying to imitate the Lamb, the Son of God, deity. And when I take a step back from that and look at those facts, what I see very clearly is Rome. That Rome is being discussed here. Now, we can talk about the various horns and the various heads and the number of heads and all those kinds of things, but when you take a step back, it's sometimes easier to get a better picture. Well, we've mentioned Revelation in the Old Testament. John uses language from the Old Testament all over the place in the book of Revelation to describe what God is now revealing to him. And remember, this is going to be language that is very familiar to the first readers of Revelation. That is a key issue. There are, depending on the writer, there are between 350 and 400 Old Testament allusions. And now that's not a direct quote, that's just something that sounds like an echo from something of the Old Testament. That's kind of a way to think about, that sounds familiar. I wonder where that's from. Well, it's going to be from the Old Testament. And then of 404 verses, 278 of those verses contain Old Testament allusions. So over half of the verses in the book contain allusions to the Old Testament. That means some of them are going to contain more than one. And most of these are going to be found in Daniel, Ezekiel, and Zechariah. Here's what I want to leave you with. You may have heard this before, and it's not true, that Revelation was written in code. It wasn't. Revelation was written to be pictured. And there is some language that's used that would have been more familiar to some readers than others, but it's not a code or a secret language that the Christians were speaking. It was a language that caused them to think and to imagine and to picture what John was seeing so that they could better understand the message from God. Now, I will say that the Jews and the first century Christians are going to better understand this than maybe the Romans would have. The Romans might have looked at this and thought, well, some of this is crazy. This doesn't make any sense to us. Well, that would be because of a lot of Revelation's reliance on the Old Testament. But the problem with using that language of Revelation being written in code is it makes us think today that we can't understand the book. We can understand this book, ladies and gentlemen. Not that we can give you a chart of every single detail, but we can understand the message of God to the people of the first century. And we can understand that it is an enduring message for us to stand strong, to keep the faith, and to keep serving God. We're not a code. We're not talking in a foreign language, but we are going to have to work. We're going to have to think through this, and we're going to have to imagine our way through some of this to enjoy this wonderful, exciting, and encouraging book. All right, I've gone too long. Hopefully most of these extra videos that I do won't be this long. Just little snippets here and there of some extra stuff that will maybe benefit our study as we go through this quarter. I'm looking forward to jumping into the book on Sunday morning. We'll be looking at chapter 1, some other introductory issues, and focusing on the Son of Man there in the beginning, and learning what we can about worship as we go through this fascinating book.